close your eyes for just a moment. Don't think about today. Don't think about your phone, your inbox the week ahead. Go back. Go all the way back. It's a Sunday morning somewhere in Britain. 1973 maybe. Or 76. The exact year doesn't matter much, because every Sunday in that decade felt like the same Sunday. A good one, a slow one, a real one. You're still in bed. The curtains are thin, and the light coming through them is pale and grey, the way British morning light always is. The house is cold. Not uncomfortable cold. Just that particular chill that lives in British homes, before anyone's lit the fire or turned on the immersion heater. Your breath doesn't quite fog, but it's close. You pull the blanket tighter, and you stay exactly where you are, because there is absolutely nowhere you need to be. And then you hear it, the clinking, that unmistakable musical rattle of glass bottles on a doorstep. The milkman. He's already been and gone. You didn't even hear the electric hum of his float rolling up the street, but he's left his calling card. 2 pints of full fat, maybe 3 if your mum left a note. And not just milk, either. Some families had bread delivered too. Eggs. Butter. The milkman was more than a delivery man. He was a lifeline on a day when every single shop in Britain was shut, completely by law. That's the first thing you need to understand about a Sunday in the 1970s. It wasn't just a day off. It was a different kind of day entirely. The shops were closed. The streets were quieter than you've probably seen them since. There was no popping to the supermarket, no quick trip to the garage for milk, no online order arriving at your door. If you hadn't planned ahead, you made do. And most families had learned through years of practice exactly how to plan ahead. Downstairs, something is already happening. You can hear it even from your bed. The low thud of the kitchen radio. The scrape of a frying pan being pulled from the cupboard under the hob. A tap running. The particular sound of Sunday morning in a British house, purposeful, unhurried, entirely familiar. Your mother is already up. She was up before you. Before almost everyone. Because Sunday for the woman of the house in 1970s Britain was the busiest cooking day of the entire week. And it started early. But before we get to the kitchen, before we get to what was happening on that hob and in that oven, there's something else arriving at your door. Something that, in many homes, was just as important as the milk. The Sunday paper. And the one sitting on that doormat told you everything you needed to know about who your family was. The newspaper was serious business on a Sunday in the 1970s. This wasn't a quick scroll through headlines. This was a ritual. A physical, ink on your fingers, takes up half the kitchen table kind of ritual. By the middle of the decade, the news of the world was selling over 6 million copies every single Sunday. 6 million. That made it not just Britain's most read Sunday paper, it was the best-selling English-language newspaper anywhere on the planet. Scandal, sport, human interest. It landed on working-class doorsteps across the country like a weekly event. You didn't just read it. You discussed it. You passed sections across the table. You read bits aloud. Middle-class households might have taken the Sunday Times instead. But whatever paper sat on your table, it was yours. Nobody was going to rush you through it. Dad usually claimed it first. That was the unspoken rule in most homes. He'd come downstairs in his dressing gown, pick it up off the mat, and settle into his chair by the fireplace, if the fire had been lit yet, or at the kitchen table. Mum, already in motion, would hand him a cup of tea without being asked. 2 sugars. A splash of milk. The same every morning of his adult life. Speaking of the fire, in most British homes in the early part of the 1970s, this was not a decorative feature. It was the heating system. Central heating was still far from universal. Ice on the inside of the windows in January was not unusual. So the fire mattered enormously. Whoever got up first dealt with it. In many homes that was Mum, who was already dealing with everything else. The grate from last night cleared out. Fresh coal laid in. A twist of newspaper. A match. The fire needed time to catch and spread before the room became truly warm, so this happened early. The whole house oriented itself around that one source of heat, like a family of planets around a small domestic sun. And while the fire took hold and the kettle went on for the second time that morning, something in the kitchen was beginning to demand attention. Something that had been quietly planned all week. Something that would define the entire shape of the day. The Sunday roast was starting, and it was going to take hours. There is no single smell in the world quite like a Sunday roast beginning to cook in a British kitchen. Not the finished dish, the beginning of it. That moment when the fat goes into the roasting tin and the oven starts to climb in temperature, and the whole house slowly fills with something warm and meaty and ancient. In the 1970s, this wasn't a special occasion meal. It was a weekly institution, and it had been that way for generations. The tradition stretches back centuries. Roast meat after church on Sunday, the whole family at the table. But by the 70s it had settled into a very specific, very British form. The cuts of meat were straightforward and unapologetic. Top side of beef. Leg of lamb, seasoned and ready for the heat. A whole chicken, which by the 70s had become affordable enough to be a family staple rather than a luxury. And in the West Country, pork, always with crackling, always slightly competitive about whose crackling was best. Whatever the meat, it went into the oven early, often before 9 in the morning. Around it, everything else had to be timed with the kind of precision that no one in the family would ever call precision, because it had simply become instinct. The roast potatoes parboiled first, then into the fat from the meat, turned once, never more. These potatoes needed about an hour to reach perfection. The Yorkshire puddings, if it was a beef household, went in at the very end. When the oven was at its hottest, they had to puff. If they didn't puff, the day was slightly off. The vegetables were cooked on the hob. Carrots, parsnips, cabbage, boiled longer than we'd consider acceptable today. Brussels sprouts, if it was winter, which in Britain it very often was. And peas, tinned peas, more often than fresh, because this was the 1970s, and tinned vegetables were not a compromise. They were simply what you used. Gravy came last, made from the meat juices in the pan, stretched with a little flour and stock. There was no packet gravy in a self-respecting household, or if there was, nobody admitted it. This meal, all of it, every component, was almost entirely prepared and cooked by one person. The mother, the woman of the house. She had been on her feet since before 7 in the morning. She would not sit down to eat until everyone else was served. She would eat slightly cooler food than everyone else at the table, because she'd spent the last 5 minutes ferrying dishes from the kitchen, and after lunch, she would wash up, by hand. There were no dishwashers in most British homes in the 1970s. Just the sink, the washing up liquid. Fairy was already the market leader, and a pair of rubber gloves if she was lucky. Pay attention to that, because it's the part of the Sunday nostalgia that gets left out of every golden-tinted memory. But before the meal came something else entirely. Something that, depending on your family, was either mandatory or quietly ignored. Something that shaped the whole morning's rhythm in a way that not many people fully appreciate anymore. Church. Not every family went, but far more families went than you might think, especially in the early part of the 1970s. Church of England congregations were still genuinely significant in British community life. The morning service, usually at 10 or 10:30, meant the whole family scrubbed up, put on their best and walked Because most families didn't own a car, or if they did, they saved the petrol. Sunday best was not a metaphor. It was a literal category of clothing that existed in most children's wardrobes in that era. The dress you didn't play in, the shirt with the collar that itched, the shoes that were polished on Saturday evening and immediately scuffed on Sunday morning. Children were turned out and inspected before leaving the house, and if your mother found fault, a smear, a crease, a button undone, she fixed it on the doorstep with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this every week since before you were born. The walk to church was, in many ways, the most social part of the whole Sunday. You saw your neighbors, the same neighbors every week in their same Sunday coats, nodding the same nods. There was a continuity to it, a reassurance. The world was still in its proper order. The service itself, the hymns, the sermon, the prayers, was for many children an exercise in endurance. The pews were hard. The sermons were long. The language of the King James Bible was beautiful and completely impenetrable to a 9-year-old. You spent a great deal of time studying the hats of the women in front of you, or counting the panes of stained glass, or trying not to fidget while your father stood ramrod straight beside you, and your mother mouthed the words of hymns she had known since childhood. But then, and here is the thing that nobody quite acknowledges, there was something genuinely moving about it. Not necessarily the religion, but the collective pausing, the stopping. Everyone in that building had agreed for 45 minutes to be somewhere that wasn't about work or money or problems. The organ played. The voices rose. Light came through the windows at an angle that made even a plain village church look briefly extraordinary. And then you all went home. And the smell hit you the moment you opened the front door. The roast. It had been doing its quiet work while you were away. The oven had been transforming raw ingredients into something ancient and essential. And now the house smelled the way a house is supposed to smell on a Sunday.
For those families who didn't go to church, the morning had a different shape. Looser, lazier, but it always arrived at the same point. By 1 o'clock, sometimes by 2, the table was being laid. The good plates, possibly, or at least the usual ones, set properly, with glasses for the squash. The family gathered around, and for an hour, nothing else mattered. But first, in many households, there was a small but important detour. The local pub, a cornerstone of the British Sunday.
The pub on a Sunday lunchtime was one of the most specifically British institutions of the 1970s. And the rules around it were peculiar, to put it charitably. Sunday licensing hours in England and Wales at the time allowed pubs to open from midday until 2 in the afternoon. 2 hours. That was it for lunchtime. Then they closed again until the evening, when they reopened from 7 until 10:30. These weren't suggestions. They were the law, governed by licensing legislation that hadn't changed substantially since the First World War, when restricting alcohol consumption had been considered vital to the war effort. 50 years later, Britain was still operating under essentially the same rules. So what happened in those 2 hours? The men went, largely the men. This wasn't universal, but it was in most working-class communities and many middle-class ones, the understood pattern. The roast was in the oven. Mum was managing it. Dad put on his jacket and walked to the local. A pint of bitter, maybe 2. A brief, comfortable exile from the house. A conversation with other men who were also briefly, comfortably exiled.
The Sunday roast was served traditionally between 1 and 3 in the afternoon. Not in the evening. That was a later shift, driven by changing habits in the decades that followed. In the 1970s, you ate your Sunday dinner at lunchtime, and it was the main event of the day. The table conversation was the most sustained of the week. Everyone was there. There was no option to be anywhere else. The shops were closed. The afternoon stretched out ahead. Nobody had anywhere to be. Seconds were expected. Leftovers were planned. Cold roast beef on Monday. Bubble and squeak from the leftover potatoes and cabbage, fried in a pan on Tuesday morning. Nothing was wasted. The whole roast was an exercise in domestic economy dressed up as celebration.
The Sunday afternoon in a 1970s British home had a quality to it that is genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who didn't experience it. It wasn't boredom exactly. It wasn't contentment entirely. It was something in between, a particular unhurried suspension of ordinary time. The fire was warm now. The coal had been catching since morning, and the living room had reached that just right temperature that British homes so rarely achieved. Warm enough to make you drowsy, not so warm that you wanted to open a window. The television was on, but quietly, almost apologetically. Because in the early part of a Sunday afternoon in the 70s there wasn't much on. The BBC and ITV both operated on the understanding that Sunday afternoon was for other things. There were farming programs, religious discussion, and slow educational content that adults found mildly interesting and children found almost physically painful. Dad was asleep. This was not a private act. It was practically an official role. He would have migrated from the table to the armchair or the sofa sometime between the last forkful and the first cup of tea after the meal. The newspaper would be open on his chest. His breathing would slow. Within minutes he was gone. This was not laziness. This was the Sunday afternoon nap. A genuine and respected British institution, as inevitable as the rain and as comfortable as old slippers.
The children, meanwhile, were navigating the particular problem of a Sunday afternoon with nowhere to go. The shops were closed. Friends' houses required planning, and Sunday was not a planned visit kind of day. It was a family day. And family days in the 1970s meant you stayed in the orbit of your own home. So you went outside. Even in February, even when it was grey and damp and the garden looked like something defeated, you went outside. You played. You found things to do in a way that required genuine creativity, because there was no screen to fall back on. No organized entertainment, no activity booked in advance by a parent. You made your own structure out of the empty afternoon. This is the part that the nostalgia industry loves to celebrate. And honestly, it deserves some celebrating, because those long, unstructured Sunday afternoons produced something. A capacity for solitude. An ability to entertain yourself. A relationship with boredom that wasn't panic, but patience. If the weather was decent, and British weather occasionally cooperated, even in the 70s, families sometimes went for a walk together after lunch. Parks. Canal towpaths. The countryside if you were close enough. Nobody called it exercise. Nobody wore special clothing for it. It was simply what you did on a Sunday afternoon when the meal had settled and the fire didn't need attending and the day still had hours left in it.
But first, something that happened in almost every British home that day, without fanfare, without complaint, simply as a matter of course. Something that younger generations find almost impossible to believe. The weekly bath. Before we get to the evening. Before the television comes on properly, and the curtains are drawn and the day begins its long, comfortable descent toward bedtime. We need to talk about the bathroom. Because Sunday in a 1970s British home wasn't complete without the bath. The weekly bath. And if you grew up in Britain in that decade, you know exactly what that means. Hot water was a precious and carefully managed resource. This was a practical reality that shaped domestic behavior in ways that today seem almost incomprehensible. Even in homes that had a boiler and an indoor bathroom, and not all did. Particularly in older housing stock, the hot water was not infinite. Heating it cost money. The immersion heater was expensive to run. You thought carefully about how much hot water you used and when. The result was a tradition that persisted well into the 1970s, inherited from earlier decades when hot water had to be heated pan by pan over a coal fire. The household bath once a week. Sunday was the most common night for it. You would be clean for the week ahead, for school on Monday, for work, for the world outside. The bathroom itself was an ordeal in winter. There was no heating in it. No radiator, no underfloor warmth, nothing. You crossed the landing at speed, dressing gown pulled tight, and the bathroom tiles sent a cold shock up through the soles of your feet the moment you stepped in. The taps were stiff, and the hot water took a moment to arrive. When it did, you got in quickly, and you stayed there, because the moment you climbed out was going to be unpleasant. Here is the part that surprises people most. In many households, particularly larger families, the bath water was shared. Not simultaneously, sequentially. The eldest went first, while the water was hottest, then the next child, then the youngest, who got the water at its coolest and by that point least fresh. The younger ones remembered this. Most of them still remember it. It was simply the way things were. Hot water was not wasted. Métis bubble bath was a common feature, that cheerful sailor-shaped bottle that made the whole thing feel slightly more like an event than a chore. Shampoo was applied carefully and rinsed thoroughly, because washing your hair was part of the Sunday evening ritual too. You went to bed clean. You started the new week properly. And while the bath was happening, one child at a time, in that chilly tiled room, the rest of the family was downstairs gathering around the television, because now the evening schedule had begun in earnest. And on a Sunday evening in the 1970s, British television had something to offer that people genuinely arranged their lives around. But here, right here, before we move to the evening, is the moment to pause and say something. If any of this is bringing something back for you, a smell, a sound, a feeling you'd almost forgotten, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Subscribe if you haven't already. Stay close, because there is so much more of this to come. Every week, another piece of Britain that we lived and loved and sometimes took for granted. Leave a comment below and tell us, what do you remember about your Sunday bath? Was the water warm or cold by the time you got in? And if you're watching with someone who lived all of this too, share it with them. They'll know exactly what we're talking about. Now, the evening. By 5 o'clock on a Sunday evening, the house had settled into its final chapter. The curtains were drawn, not against dark exactly, but against the grey that had been sitting outside all day. The fire was on its second or third load of coal. Someone had made tea. Not a sit-down tea, necessarily, more of a drifting, ongoing tea, cups appearing and disappearing in the way they always did on Sundays, the kettle seemingly never fully cold, and the television was on. Now, the television of a Sunday evening in the 1970s requires some explanation, because it wasn't just entertainment. It was structured, it was curated, and parts of it were actually controlled by forces that had nothing to do with audience ratings. The BBC and ITV both operated under what was known informally as the God slot, a period of Sunday evening programming, typically from around 6:30 to 7:30, that was set aside for religious content. Songs of Praise on the BBC had been running since 1961. Stars on Sunday on ITV ran from 1969 until 1979, presenting a mixture of hymns and devotional music with celebrity guests. It pulled extraordinary viewing figures, as many as 16 million viewers at its peak. The Ondine Line, a seafaring drama set in the 19th century, running from 1971 to 1980, was precisely the kind of television a Sunday night was built for: sweeping, serious, emotionally satisfying. You watched it as a family, in the warm living room, and nobody spoke much while it was on. The signature Khachaturian music that opened each episode became one of the most recognizable themes in British television. And across the decade there was Last of the Summer Wine, which had begun on BBC One in January 1973, and would go on to become the longest-running sitcom in television history. Gentle, Yorkshire set, deeply human. It didn't demand much from you. It gave a lot. The television in that room, probably a rented set, because renting televisions was entirely normal in the 1970s. When purchasing one outright was a significant expense, was the fixed point around which the whole family arranged itself. Mum on the sofa, finally sitting down for the first time since morning. Dad in his chair. Children on the carpet, possibly with a biscuit, definitely in their pajamas. And the evening moved slowly,
warmly toward its conclusion.
Supper, in the 1970s British home, was not a performance. Nobody called it supper, strictly speaking. It was just something before bed, something modest and warming that arrived without ceremony and was consumed without much comment. Beans on toast was entirely acceptable. Soup from a tin, poured into a saucepan and heated on the hob, with bread and butter beside it. Cheese on toast, made under the grill and brought in on the plate with the cheese still bubbling slightly at the edges. If there was anything left from the afternoon roast, it might reappear now. A cold slice of meat, a roll with some leftover stuffing, nothing complicated. The elaborate cooking was over. This was the home stretch. And with supper came the drinks. Not alcohol, not for the children, and usually not for the adults either at this hour on a Sunday. This was the era of Horlicks and Ovaltine, those malted milk drinks that existed as the correct and proper way to end a British evening. Horlicks had been sold in Britain since the late 19th century, and by the 70s was actively marketing itself as a cure for what it called, somewhat dramatically, night starvation, a condition it had effectively invented. It didn't matter. The mug of Horlicks was warm and sweet and thick, and it tasted like the end of the day, and that was enough. The children went to bed first. This was not negotiated. Bath time was done. Pajamas were on. The Sunday routine wound down with a particular finality. The week was genuinely about to begin again. School tomorrow. Back to the ordinary texture of things. The Sunday had been its own country, with its own rules and its own pace, and now the border was closing.
A parent came upstairs. A light was turned off, and in the cold of the bedroom, remember, the fire only heated the living room. You pulled the blankets up around your chin and listened to the house, the television murmuring downstairs, the occasional voice, the distant sound of a car on the road outside, the specific silence of a Sunday night, which is different from any other silence in the week. Fuller, slower. Downstairs, the adults sat for a while longer. The television continued. BBC One closed down in those years with the national anthem, the screen going dark and quiet in a way that felt conclusive. Not just the end of the evening, the end of a broadcast day. There was something almost ceremonial about it. The broadcaster signing off for the night, the country being given its permission to sleep. Mum collected the mugs, rinsed them in the sink, quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. Checked that the fireguard was properly in place because a coal fire left unguarded through the night was a genuine danger and everyone knew it. Turned off the lights, one room at a time, and the house went quiet. Properly quiet. The kind of quiet that a house only reaches when everyone in it has come to rest after a day that asked something of all of them. A day that had its own shape. Morning, meal, afternoon, bath, evening, sleep, and stuck to that shape without apology.
Just one more thing. The most important part. The part that only really makes sense now from this distance. Here is what nobody tells you about the 1970s British Sunday. Not the historians, not the television documentaries, not the nostalgia programs that show you archive footage of the high street with its closed shop fronts and play some brass band music underneath. What nobody tells you is that the Sunday worked, not because life was simpler. Life in 1970s Britain was not simple. There were power cuts and strikes, and the 3-day week, and money worries, and marriages that were difficult, and children who were not easy, and houses that were cold and damp in ways that weren't romantic at all. The decade had a hard edge that the nostalgia often softens past recognition. The shops being closed wasn't an inconvenience. It was a gift. Because it meant there was no decision to make about whether to go shopping. There was no errand to run. There was nothing to optimize. The Sunday was what it was, and what it was. Coal fire, Sunday paper, roast dinner, afternoon quiet, cold bathroom, Horlicks, early bed was enough. More than enough. There's a loss in not having that anymore. And it's not the roast dinners we've lost, or the Horlicks, or even the sensation of cold bathroom tiles on a Sunday evening. Those things are still available if you want them. What we've lost is the agreement, the collective decision to stop, the shared understanding that one day out of 7 was not for commerce or productivity or self-improvement, but simply for being together in the same house, eating the same meal, watching the same television, in the same warmth, in the same country. If you grew up in one of those houses, and if you're watching this, there's a very good chance you did. You carry some version of that Sunday inside you. You know what it felt like to come in from a cold afternoon and have the house smell of roasting meat. You know the specific comfort of a father asleep in an armchair, and a mother finally sitting down with a cup of tea she'd earned a dozen times over. You know the sound of hymns on the television at 6 o'clock, and the way the evening came in around the edges of the curtains, and the particular weight of clean pajamas after a bath. That was Britain. Your Britain. And it deserved to be remembered. Properly, honestly, warmly, in exactly the way it actually was. The roast, the fire, the cold, the family, the silence. Don't let anyone tell you that was nothing. It was everything.